Good morning, everyone. We'll be starting this panel. My name is Jose Santos. I'm the CEO of Enartis USA. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I would like to start thanking the organization of this conference for inviting me to moderate this panel on the impact of climate change and how it is affecting the vineyard and the winemaking practices. I would like also to thank and congratulate my fellow panelists for being here. Clint Nelson, from the Director of Vineyard Operations of Beckstoffer Red Hills, which I'm sure that many of you will know and are familiar with Beckstoffer. And also Francisco Rodriguez, who is visiting us from Mexico, flew here on purpose to be with us today to share his experience. Francisco is the head winemaker for Casa Madero, which is the oldest winery in all the Americas. So it's been continuously functioning since 1597. So a lot of time. Of course, Francisco has not been there since the beginning, but he has been there for a long time, and is definitely a reference in the Mexican wine industry that is definitely booming. So I'm not a specialist in climate change. I'm just going to try to put a little bit, set a little bit of background of framing this presentation. And I will start that by sharing something that I've seen after talking with the organization a few months ago. I started paying a little bit more attention to what was coming up in the news. Basically, I will outline why we chose this topic and why we are talking about this. We will look at how climate change affects wine growing. I will talk a little bit about the different things that we can do to mitigate, and then Clint and Francisco will be more specific with their individual experiences. And then we will also have some tasting. So after Clint's presentation and after Francisco, we will taste the wines that you have in front of you. Unfortunately, due to border crossing issues, we don't have Francisco's wines of his trial, so we have a similar trial that we did here in the US, and I really appreciate all the effort of Francisco to make sure that he would send us the wines on time, but unfortunately that didn't happen. But so, to start, when I started looking at this topic, I started literally looking at the news and the different newsletters that I receive, and probably every day there is some articles, some news about climate change and wine growing, that it's coming for the wine, that is changing the wine. I think that a few years ago we were probably considering, is it really affecting us, or is this a thing of the future? I think that we all agree that it is, and we are all, we are all observing different signs of these changes. So there are more instances of severe weather events. We just went through a very severe drought, floods, and out-of-season cold events, probably not so much on the West Coast, but definitely the East Coast of the United States was really affected this year with freeze out of season. We all know, and I really hate to talk about this topic, but the wildfires that affect us all in different ways. And we all hear about production moving to different locations, and so production that we talk about, Tattinger starting to have their own vineyards in the south of England. I heard Sweden also that they are starting to plant vineyards, so this is definitely a sign that things are changing. And without being very scientific, and this is the only scientific reference that I have in this presentation. If you don't know this lady, Elizabeth Walkovich, please Google. She's amazing, and she really got specialized in the impact of climate change in winemaking. And she says that wine is the bellwether of climate change. And the reason why is that definitely from a phenological point of view, grapevines are probably the most diverse species that we have. You can have, if we compare Pinot Noir and a Cabernet grown in the same climate, in the same conditions, they behave completely differently. And more than that, we have, in terms of records, wine growing has probably the best records on history because of the church. And we have probably 700 to 800 years of records of harvest, especially, of course, in Europe, that are not a direct measure of temperature, but are correlated with the temperature and with the climate change. So definitely, grape growing and winemaking can be a little bit the canary in a coal mine for climate change. And this definitely, when we talk about climate and we talk about terroir, climate is a component of it. And just as an example, and I'm sure that you all have been facing these situations where we see that the sugar accumulation by the vine is not coupled with the phenolics and the aromas. And so you either harvest unripe grapes from a phenolic or from an aromatic point of view, or you need to leave the grapes hanging in the vineyard. And so in terms of the impact that this brings into winemaking, definitely we are seeing, as I was mentioning, a decoupling of sugar and phenolics and flavor and aroma accumulation. Very significant vintage to vintage variation. And so in terms of ensuring market consistency and brand consistency, this is definitely a challenge. Aging capacity, we have higher pHs, we have changed redox potential of the wines because of the different accumulation of the different compounds. And so these things are changing. Assimilable nitrogen also, so if you have a stressed vine, they will start producing proteins and not as much viable or available nitrogen. Higher pH, and this is what actually I'm most familiar with in our labs. We test thousands of samples of juices and wines. And when I first joined Enartis in the US almost 10 years ago, pHs were high, but I wasn't seeing a lot of 4s and 4.1s in the juice stage. Now it's a common thing. The same thing with potassiums, that we might have potassiums in the thousands, 1,500, 300, and now it's possible to have 4,000 milligrams per liter of potassium. Calcium, same thing, that we have not seen. When I first started here and with our former enologist, John Katchmer, I asked him, so are there any issues of calcium in the US? No, only in Texas and nowhere else. We now have issues of calcium. We did a study with a sparkling producer comparing 2013 till 2019, and we passed from 70 milligrams per liter in average to 90, which is in the instability levels. So issues that were not there are coming up, and so we need to really take that in consideration. And alcohol adjustments, so if we have higher bricks and we decide to leave the grapes hanging in the vine a little bit longer, we will definitely need to deal with this in a different way. We will have, of course, in the US, you can water down, so it's one solution. Francisco is actually talking about a different way of trying to reduce the alcohol by using different yeast strains. And a little bit of coupling of these alcohol adjustments and the pH. That is, by using some yeast, you can actually, by reducing the alcohol, also help to increase a little bit the natural acidity. Then, in terms, if we try to summarize in terms of the overall impact of climate change, definitely we need to think about the identity of the wine. So a house, a winery that is famous for their Cabernet, probably in 20 years may not be able to produce Cabernet. So and also the typicity of the wines from a given region. Profitability, definitely, if we have hailstorms or if we have smoke events, or definitely there will be losses in production, and of course we'll have associated with that higher production costs. And the final quality, definitely quality inconsistency that we may face. And for me, mainly the vintage to vintage variation that for the consumer, it's a very critical point to be aware that a certain wine has a certain style and that they can rely on that. So what can we do? I separated this, and I'm just giving some examples, and this came out of the reading that I did and the research, all the research that I did, and my personal thoughts. So I would separate this in a long-term versus short-term. One thing that, listening to the podcast from Elizabeth Volkovich, I got a little bit depressed because we realized that we can't really make a big dent on it individually, but definitely her suggestion is that try to do something and tell your friends that you are doing it. So maybe everyone does a little bit, and we collectively will make a dent and make this change. Separate this in between long-term versus short-term, and the direct impact versus indirect impact. So talking about long-term actions, and I'm sure that Clint will be talking about this, evaluating the use of different rootstocks that will be more adapted to the new growing conditions, evaluate new varieties. I just read that Bordeaux has just approved a couple of non-Bordeaux varietals, including a Torrigo Nacional, a Portuguese one. So, consider planting in new growing regions, so moving north in the northern hemisphere or moving south in the southern hemisphere, so get pole bound. Develop new cover crops that can potentially help with drought and floods. In terms of indirect impact, definitely overall reduction of the carbon footprint of the winery. Really take any action that you can have in trying to mitigate the carbon footprint of your winery, and definitely associated with this, minimize the use of water and maximize its utilization, whether it's in the winery or in the vineyard. In terms of direct impact, one option is definitely to adjust the trellis systems. It can be using shade cloth, could be, I heard about some wineries already using mists and creating a wet environment around the vineyards, which it's not very sustainable, so I wouldn't go necessarily that direction. I would say that definitely with these changes, monitoring the grape quality and the evolution of the quality during variation is a even more critical aspect now, and that we should maximize the existing tools to assist in harvest decisions. Definitely a very in-depth understanding of the chemistry of the juice before making any adjustments. If there are significant acid adds that you need to do, it's important to do that earlier to minimize the organoleptic impact. One thing that we really recommend to all our customers is to do a predictive acid panel in their juices and understand where they will fall in terms of pH and TA post-alcoholic fermentation, and make the adjustments accordingly since the beginning. Consider the use of different acids. So we typically use tartaric, but it's possible to use malic, lactic, succinic. So there are different acids that can be used. And definitely in terms of knowing your bricks and understand what you will have to do to adjust that, so you don't end up with a 17% alcohol wine. In terms of short-term or medium-term actions, in terms of indirect impact, definitely to improve soil microbiome, and there are some tools available to do that. Reduce the energy consumption by the wineries. So we all know that cold stabilization and the use of cold in general in the winery is the big energy consumer and the biggest contributor in terms of carbon footprint of the winery. So think about what you can do to try to reduce the use of cold. In the juice settling, the use of enzymes will allow you to cut the time of settling in half or even less than that, so you don't really need to keep that tank cold longer, even though the highest impact of energy is to get it cold, but also to maintain it cold, you need to keep spending energy. In terms of fermentation, maybe find the right pairing between the yeast and the variety, and you probably don't need to keep the tank at 55 or 60 Fahrenheit. You can afford to ferment at 68 or something like that, and have the same quality of wine at the end. And in terms of cold stabilization, definitely the use, and there are very innovative cold stabilizers, and I don't say this because we have one that is very innovative, but there are a lot of different colloidal stabilizers that can be used and basically replace the use of cold. And I saw a presentation a couple of weeks ago that about capturing CO2 from fermentations, and I think that this is something, I don't know the state of the art on this, but I think it will be definitely something that could be looked into. And with this, I basically pass the word on to our first panelist, Clint, that will be talking about how the viticultural practices are changing in order to address the climate change.
Terrific.
Yeah, oh, sorry.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Oh, sounds like so. Excellent. Well, first,
Which
one's?
That one. Oh, next one.
Oh, there we go.
Prior.
Terrific.
It's sensitive.
Yes. I'd like to thank the people at Win Expo for inviting me to speak here, and also Jose and his team for all their help with our analytics. So they are basically our satellite lab for most of the analyses that we do, and I'm hoping one day Jose will actually bring a satellite lab up to Red Hills so I don't have to go all the way to Windsor. But until then, we'll keep trekking it down there.
Yeah.
So again, my name is Clint Nelson. Here's a little bit about me. There we go. I have a bachelor's in biology, a master's degree in viticulture and enology. I have worked across almost all the AVAs within California, minus everything in Temecula and south of that. I've either lived there or worked there, or something in between. Currently, I am a director of vineyard operations for Beckstoffer Red Hills. That's one of the sister companies for the larger umbrella Beckstoffer Vineyards. And we are one of the largest, or the largest, wine grape producers in Lake County, and we are 97% Cabernet Sauvignon. It's a lot of cab. We do cab well, and we do a lot of it. So with that being said, we'll jump into the presentation. I'm having trouble with this. So what's happening? What are we seeing right now with climate change? Jose said it eloquently. It is depressing, and sadly, with it being so depressing, we need to find ways to adapt and acclimate and continue driving the quality wines, especially for people that are like me, 97% Cabernet. How are we going to keep sustaining Cabernet Sauvignon in this climate, in the industry? Sorry there. So don't throw away your farmer's almanac, but, well, maybe you should. That's kind of a joke I have here. Things are changing rapidly and quickly. So the way the seasons used to adjust and the way that seasons were predictable is not so predictable anymore. And what we're seeing is these big variations in cold spikes, heat spikes, floods, hailstorms, and then the worst thing of all, fire and smoke events, which is causing smoke taint. The earlier session did a terrific job about talking about how we can remediate that in the winery. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of things we can do on the grape growing side. So again, what are we seeing? We're seeing more extreme weather events. We're seeing increase in growing degree days or heat accumulation hours. If any of you are familiar with that term, And so what that's doing is it's driving simultaneously an increase in vigor. And if you don't manage that vigor correctly, it's going to decrease your quality. The biggest enemy to a lot of us right now in the at least red grape growing business is fruiting zone congestion. So you can talk about cluster stacking, cluster congestion, or multiple leaf layers shading your fruit. So if you can avoid those things, that will help you tremendously with both mouthfeel, color, and even aromatic compounds. We're also seeing a shifting in season. So we're having, for us at least, a later rainy season. We're having warmer, drier summers and colder falls, and not only colder falls, but colder springs. So we have to delay planting of our new vineyards. We can't plant before almost the second week of May anymore because we're having frost events at the end of April and first week of May. We're having hailstorms in that time too. Fast forward to autumn months or fall. This past year, Jose touched on the East Coast having a lot of issues with unseasonable frost events. We lost maybe 15 to 20% of a new planting this fall due to unseasonable frost events. And so it's just becoming more and more difficult for us to farm the way that we used to farm. So we, as growers, as vintners, and as people in this industry, we need to be able to accommodate and acclimate to this changing environment. Otherwise, it's going to be really difficult to be successful moving forward. We're also seeing a condensed growing season. So I don't know if any of you guys experienced this last year, or this past season, I should say, but we had a very wet and cold spring, so bud break was delayed by 2 weeks for us. Fast forward to fruit set and veraison, those all caught up immediately, and we were almost a week ahead come harvest. So talk about a wacky season, right? We're 2 weeks delayed on bud break, but we're picking a week early. What the heck is going on? And so that's all associated with those increase in growing degree days and heat accumulation hours with the more sporadic weather events. And lastly here, it's the thing I'd least like to talk about, but we're having hotter, more dry, and less humid summers, which lead to, there's supposed to be a little animation there. It's supposed to lead to fire. And fire is definitely one of those 4-letter words. Don't like to say it too often because it means it leads to a 5-letter word that we don't like to say either, which is smoke. And so those two things are a real issue for us. And the earlier session talking about smoke taint and how you can remediate it in the wine, they touched on briefly how you can remediate it or prevent it in the field. We did some trials with the adjuvants, or the surfactants, I should say, like fruit wash. We actually saw that fruit wash made the compounds worse, or the accumulation of compounds worse. And then if you want to talk about protection barriers, Australia is having some work out there being published, or was published a few years ago, showing that surround or kaolin clay can help prevent the absorption of guaiacol and methyl guaiacol in your fruit. However, I don't know if anybody here, I'm sure most of you have worked with kaolin clay. If you don't get the clay off, then you're dealing with the issue anyways in your winery, which is a huge problem. And so with that in mind, we actually did some kaolin clay trials, and we were out there with a pressure washer hitting the fruiting zone. It was ridiculous and completely time-consuming because we couldn't get the damn stuff off the grape clusters. So not practical, not a way that you're going to solve smoke events, but hopefully we can figure that out with some type of barrier in the future. So this was a video, and unfortunately I don't think it's going to play right now, but we had a huge hailstorm, speaking of sporadic weather events, this year in the Red Hills AVA, at least for Beckstoffer Vineyards. We were having hail the size of the tip of your thumb. It was the biggest hail I've seen in California, almost reminiscent of something you see in the Midwest. And so what happened, this hailstorm persisted for about 30 to 45 minutes. It was chaotic. We had people running for cover. And what it resulted in was a 30% reduction in production overall, which is huge when you expand that across almost 1,600 acres. So we took a big hit. As you can see here, this is what happened. That 30% reduction in production was associated with a 29% reduction in cluster weights compared to historical averages. So you can see varying degrees from left to right there. It was terrible. It was really hard to stomach. And with that being said, as a viticulturist, as a wine grape grower, I used to say fruit set was the most stressful time of the year. You know, you're crossing your fingers. You hope you get through fruit set without any crazy rainstorms, windstorms, hailstorms like this. But you know what? That's not the worst time of the year for me anymore as a wine grape grower. The worst time of the year for me is harvest. Not because of actual harvest, but because of the potential of smoke taint. And this is a huge issue because it can ruin your whole vintage. So you're not talking about a reduction in yield like you are with poor set. You're talking about the inability to market and sell a wine. And that's just terrible. So hopefully it looks promising with remediation of smoke tainted wines in the winery. And hopefully we as wine grape growers can figure out how to solve that issue with barriers or protecting the fruit prior to sending it to the winery. I also want to talk about weather and heat accumulation. So I did touch on growing degree days. I borrowed this figure from Dr. Jones and Linfield out of Oregon. And what this is showing is the accumulation or increase in accumulation of growing degree days from 1890 to 2018 last year. And so what we see in that over about 120-year span is that areas in the North Coast AVA are transitioning from a region 2 growing area, which means very low vigor, very low heat accumulation hours, all the way to a region 4, which is 2 regions different. So you're talking about changing everything. This is to say that if you were growing grapes back in the early 1900s, you would have to have a totally different trellis system, rootstock selection, managing practices than you do now. And that's what we're figuring out on the fly. So with that said, climate change it's happening, it's here now, and we have to deal with it. And this increase in growing degree days impacts vigor tremendously, so you need to figure out how to combat that vigor with everything that we have at our disposal. So I presented the problems. How do we adapt? Jose touched on this too. We need to go in with appropriate planting material. I have a couple slides further down in the deck, a trial that we're working on in collaboration with UC Davis, Duarte Vineyards, and the Lake County Wine Grape Commission, talking about just that, appropriate planting material. We need to adjust our trellis systems. So not to offend anybody that's a third generation farmer or vintner here, but this isn't your grandparents' vineyard anymore. Things have changed and they're changing quickly. So if you can go mechanized or if you need to go mechanized, there's a lot of promising work coming out of Oakville Research Station talking about the benefits of high wire, mechanized high wire systems. Or you could do something like a stack T where you're opening up that fruiting zone and dividing the 2 planes of light interception. Or if you can afford to, and you have the labor to pull off handwork, then the lyre or elkhorn, whatever you can do to alleviate congestion. You can see the 2 bolded bullet points I have here. Avoid congestion and excessive shading, and then promote vine capacity and vine balance. So everybody likes to talk about vine balance, but it is critical. And please, if you're not on the coast and you're not subjected to half your day being in a fog belt, don't go in with a traditional VSP anymore, because that's just setting yourself up for failure. It's way too condensed, it's way too tight of a system, and you need to really open that up. Otherwise, you're going to be spending a lot of money on cultural practices to try and open up that fruiting zone and alleviate congestion. Furthermore, dry down soil before initiation of irrigation. I just talked a little bit earlier about how we had a very wet and cold spring. We didn't need to irrigate, besides a couple fertigation events, until the end of July, and in some blocks into August. So we're looking at like a 2.5 to 3 month irrigation season. That's it. No need to compound your problem with dealing with this increase in vigor by over-irrigating early in the year. It just doesn't make any sense, and you're setting yourself up for more work and also decreased quality. So I have this picture here. When I mentioned the VSP, I like to use the analogy, don't drive a square peg into a round hole. So let the vine do what the vine wants to do, and don't try to force it into a smaller trellis system that is outdated and not appropriate for today's growing climate. So now I'd like to talk about 3 projects and/or trials that we're doing up in the Red Hills AVA. This picture is from one of those projects, and the first one I'll talk about is the impact of cultural practices on a low-vigor mountainside vineyard. Then I'll transition into that rootstock and appropriate planting material conversation I was discussed earlier, and then I'll wrap up with a Blue Vite 3-year review on establishing an established cane prune vineyard block. So this case study that we worked is really a winemaker trial, was on Cabernet Sauvignon 337 10114, planted in 2013, north to south row orientation on a modified VSP. So we initially went in with a VSP and then we opened it up with cross arms. So this is on 12-inch cross arms to alleviate that congestion. The control was traditionally farmed practices, so it was sustained deficit where we just applied about the same amount of water on weekly. We opened up the morning side of the canopy or the fruiting zone a lot. And so what I'm going to get into is actually the impacts of intercepted light or UV radiation on fruit quality. And so we opened up that morning side a lot with the traditional farm compared to the treatment A, B, and C. And overexposure can be your other enemy. So I've been talking a lot about how you need to combat congestion and excessive shading. Well, don't take it too far, because if you take it too far, you actually get anthocyanin degradation, you impede the phenolic pathways, and you can decrease your berry quality through raisoning, shriveling, and aromatics and everything else. So the first treatment, treatment A, got that early season deficit where we withheld initiation of irrigation, and it was tunnel leaf removal where we left one leaf layer exterior to the clusters in the fruiting zone. Treatments B and C were similar in that they received that early season deficit, but we actually didn't need to do any leafing, which was terrific. So we saved some money on cultural practices, but this, again, that's why I had the caveat, low vigor mountainside vineyard. So there was about 1.5 leaf layers. If you guys are familiar with leaf layer numbers, that's the numbers of leaves exterior to your clusters. So this was about 1.5 leaf layers, if you can imagine that, not overly shaded, because as viticulturists and vintners, we need to find that balance between shade and overexposure. And so I'll jump into the numbers here. What we saw is that the control had a decreased color, tannins, and also beta-damascenone, or aromatic potential. And I have to give a big thank you to Jose and the artist team, because I believe they're the only lab, the commercial lab in California, actually quantifying beta-damascenone or nor-isoprenoid content in wine grapes right now. A lot of people are doing it in the wine, but not in wine grapes. So this is a good indicator of how much flavor or aroma potential your wine can have in the fruit. So what we see here is an increase by actually having more protection on the fruiting zone. So that, again, it's that balancing act between overexposure and underexposure. So grape growing is not only becoming more difficult with all the climate variables that we need to deal with, but it's also becoming trickier with implementing cultural practices to really fine-tune and dial in grape quality on the long term. What we see here is actually the best fruit that we pulled from this trial was the one where we didn't do any leafing. We left the top of the vine or the VSP system untucked, so you can call that a lazy VSP with a little bit of shading and hangover. We didn't hedge this either, whereas the control was tightly box hedged. And so all that led to more protection of the fruiting zone and ability to maintain and retain those secondary metabolites that are key for a high quality wine in the long run. And so one thing I also want to note here is that treatment C was exactly the same as treatment B, except that we hung it out about a week longer. And so that extended hang time led to some berry shrivel, higher bricks that winemakers are having to deal with by adding water if they can or other means. And that actually decreased all metrics related to quality. So it decreased tannin or mouthfeel components, it decreased color, and it decreased the aromatic potential. So I'll sum it up in this next slide here. Well, this is the control. Before I get to the summary, this is a picture of the control. You can see it was box hedge with a very open morning side fruiting zone. What we're seeing is it's not prudent of us to do that opening of the morning side in our growing region, because it's, even though it's on the shade or the morning side, it's still too much sun and overexposed. And then here's a picture of what it looks like when you hang it out too long and you get a lot of basal leaf defoliation and shriveling, and this also decreases quality compared to what our best treatments were. So our key findings from this little winemaker trial that we did was optimized light increased aromatic potential. And I want to say optimize, not maximize, because if you maximize the light, you're going to get a lot of anthocyanin degradation and everything else. UV radiation is not necessarily your friend when you're talking about grape quality. And less is more in this instance, where no leaf removal on a low vigor mountainside block contributed to better quality, and overexposure decreased major chemistry metrics. And then again, counter to what many people believe, extended hang time did not positively influence aromatic content or color, and quality markers were reduced due to dehydration and overexposure. So that's it for the winemaker trial. Now I want to jump into a big collaboration that we're doing at Beckstoffer Vineyards Red Hills with UC Davis, Duarte Vineyards, and the Lake County Wine Grape Commission. And this is, again, relating to the appropriate planting material. And since we're 97% Cabernet Sauvignon, we thought, well, heck, let's try to figure out what the best combinations of Cabernet Sauvignon on a list of 10 different rootstocks can drive quality in an ever-changing and more difficult environment. So we're really excited about this project. Unfortunately, all the vines are still in grow tubes, so I don't have any data to show you yet, but if we circle back in about 6 or 7 years, I can go over a lot of that with you guys. So again, this is a deep dive into 10 Cabernet clones across 10 different rootstocks. It's known in the academia world as the mother of all Cabernet trials. It's a very aggressive trial, and maybe I've been told it's probably the most aggressive and extensive and largest Cabernet rootstock trial ever put together. So I have to give a lot of credit to Dr. Con Curderall out of Oakville Research Station. He's very ambitious in these types of things. So this is a mixture of novel materials and heritage selections. And the goal of this project is to assess hardiness, yield components, fruit quality, and water use efficiency in an increasingly challenging environment. And so here's a snapshot of the different rootstocks and clones we're looking at. So you want to think about having that, again, drought-tolerant, cold-tolerant rootstocks across a litany of novel and heritage clones. And so, again, down the road, we're very excited about what this project will yield as far as seeing the future of Cabernet growing in the North Coast AVA. If anybody here has extra time when they get home, we had CBS national news come out, and if you Google saving Cabernet from climate change, you can see a couple discussions of myself, Dr. Con Curderall, and Andy Beckstoffer talking about the trial in greater detail. So my last slide here, and the last project that we're working with is a collaboration with the Blue Vite folks, and we're pretty excited about this. So Blue Vite, and we'll taste some wines from Blue Vite, but not from my vineyard, unfortunately. Up in the Beckstoffer Red Hills, we're just simple farmers, so I'm trying to get Jose to make some wines next year. But this is an innovation to improve microbiota habitat in the soil, and so it's been known to increase macro and micronutrient uptake, increase water stress tolerance, which we've seen in spades, where the control has a lot more dehydration and shrivel compared to the treatments, and then increase yields and fruit quality too. And so one thing that I think has been a pleasant surprise for everybody involved in this is that we have a lot of cane prune vines, and if anybody has a cane prune Cabernet before, you know it has a lot of blind buds. Well, what we're seeing with this product, which is worth its weight in gold, is a significant decrease in blind buds. So you're talking about increasing production and quality simultaneously while having less variability within your vineyard blocks, which is just tremendous. So something we are incredibly excited about. We're transitioning into the third year, and so I think after that point, we'll start presenting chemistry numbers and fruit quality numbers as well. So until then, that's about it.
Yep.
And I'll pass
Thank
it on.
you. So you have the wines 1 and 2. These are wines from Dow Vineyards and Winery in Paso Robles. They were one of, together with Clint, were one of the partners that collaborated with us with the Blue Vite trials in 2018. And fortunately, with Dow, they managed to keep the control and the treated block together. Dow is now treating 100% of their vineyards, with the exception of the control block, because I refused to sell if he wouldn't keep the control. These are basically the analytical data. The wines just finished ML. We got the wines yesterday. JT brought him with him from there. And you can see the analytical data. One impressive aspect is that we have much more uniformity between in terms of production. The control this year was actually harvested a couple of days later because it was not yet to the point for harvesting. And in terms of fermentation, and if any of you knows Daniel Dow, is a very, I would call him a phenolics fanatic. Because he really monitors phenolics throughout the fermentation several times per day, even, and really found that we had at a peak of anthocyanins during vinification and the control with 19% more total anthocyanins. And in general, we not only maintain the quality, but we actually increase the quality and the concentration of phenolics while increasing also the yield. And without taking much of Francisco's time, I will pass it on to him to talk about a second project of addressing climate change. So, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. We are talking about the low yeast, low alcohol production yeast. And what happened with this trial? We start with this trial with the UEV. UEV is of the Bureau Office International they have been doing for the last 2 years. With this same team, we are working South Africa, Italy, Spain, Australia, and Mexico. We present the result in Paris in March. And thank you for the invitation to this presentation. It's the second year that we work with the same yeast. We are working with the one. Okay, I was working for the last 47 years in Casa Madero Winery. It's fused with the steel product, brandy, and 40 years in winemaking. Casa Madero is the oldest winery in the American continent and oldest wine in the New World wine. We are located in the north of Mexico. We are at 1,500 sea level. That condition is very special condition because we have a semi-desertic weather that like too much some special grape like Shiraz, special for this climate. And that's it. We have a warmer day and cool night. And the dry, cool, and nice. The earth are nice, cool, and dry, and that we don't have, or we have less problem for fungus problem. The precipitation is not too much, with 20 millimeters by year is practically nothing. But the other point, we have a evaporation of 3,000 millimeters by year, and then we need additional water, deep irrigation. Full time. Okay, we are regarding the climate. It's the last 10 years. Our register is our increase to 3 to 5 degrees. The last information of the Union Organization National International. They say this 3 degrees. Each area have different conditions, and our area really we change. The more heated with low precipitation and more the desert condition increase. What happened with this? We are working. Okay. What happened with the grape? The phenolic their ripeness is really no good because we have more concentration of sugar, and the C is green. And then you had more alcohol and green tannin, the astringent, unripe tannin, and then, for example, we don't have any option of a water addition. It's low, is not considered a water addition. That is a big problem for all. Okay, we are talk about the trial what we are doing with the last 2 years. Yeah, we are working for 2 years. The control is Saccharomyces, and we are working with 2 years with the low potassium alcohol. We are Uvarum, U42, Saccharomyces uvarum, Candida simpliciana. We have with similar results the last 2 years. The Candida for less 1 to 1.1 alcohol percent alcohol less, with comparison with the control. What some literature mentioned is you can find 1.5 less, but at this moment we are working with more winery condition, because we're working with 3 ton by each batch with 3 ton. It's not a lab condition. That is really normal winery condition. We are in this area, Saltillo, northern of Mexico. You see that there's a very name Parras grapevine in English, and unfortunately you say. This is the area that we are. We have 400 hectares of vineyard, with more traditional grapes. Okay. We see the result. Saccharomyces and artichoke. We see the control, the juice, with exactly the same grape, Cabernet Sauvignon, in the 2 years. If you see, we have exactly similar condition of vinification. This is the trial monitoring of the fermentation. It's really not too fermented, not too high. You see, with nutrition, we have high nutrition. Why? But it's safe that the fermentation finish, because with less nutrition, the problem is that you have sugar in your wine, and it is not worth the try. Okay. You say Uvarum. You look at it's less alcohol, but the 5 years is because they have 14.7 to 14.2, and this is trial fermentation. You have the additional nutrition, like I talked about, the nutrition. For that, winery is high, huh? That is not commercial use. Okay. This is the Candida. If you see, the fermentation is similar in all. About the speed of fermentation, with the same addition. But the Candida is a co-inoculation. Okay, this is the more important that we are working for this one. You see the control, 14.7. It is this year. Last year is 14.1. Ubarron 40.2, last year 13, this year Canada 30.7, last year 30.3. And then we are continuing to work with this trial, maybe for the next 5 years, because the result for accept this yeast for the OEV need to be very many trials to be said that this is working or don't working. But the more important for us in Mexico is that point. Okay. We pay tax less than 47% of the cost of one bottle. Okay. If we have more than 40, we pay 54% of tax. And then the yeast is working, we had 1% alcohol with the same sugar, with the same wine, and less alcohol. And what happened with this wine? Well, this one is more fruity, this one is more fresh, it's not higher in alcohol, because you can a good option. I wait that this work is good. We wait that in future time we had one really good yeast for make wine with less alcohol. Another country for the UV are working with another product to reduce the alcohol, no mechanical, no. We use enzymes like Germany and Portugal. But we are continuing to work with the same yeast for some years. Unfortunately, the tasting of our wine is not arrived. We send on time, but the problem is the border, not arrived. But we can talk, well, in my experience, the wine, we say, overall, for me, in taste, is the more full body and soft. That the control. And Candida is maybe less body, but is the aroma increase the aroma. But in the wine, we're looking for more complexity and less astringent and easy wine to drink. And that increase of some products in the fermentation, that's increased more movely, more soft, more easy wine to drink. Okay, thank you. If you have any question, very welcome.
Thank you, Francisco. And as Francisco said, he diligently sent us the wine from Mexico over a month ago, but unfortunately, due to the customs, it's still stuck. So we hope to get those wines. In the meantime, we had the opportunity, because we did similar trials here in US, and we got this wine that we were going to pour in our booth, but I decided to share with all of you. That is a trial that we did this year with the Buttonwood Winery in Santa Ynez Valley. In this case, we only did the control versus the U42. There is a difference in the U42 here because Francisco tried it. This is a very new product. We did the first industrial production this year, and it didn't make on time for Francisco, so we sent him liquid pure culture to Mexico, and the commercial product is actually a blend of the Saccharomyces uvarum with the Saccharomyces cerevisiae, so it's not a pure culture. As you can see, in terms of the effect in the ethanol, is not such a dramatic impact, so there is some reduction, but not dramatic. But as I mentioned initially, this is one of the trials, one of the approaches that we find in terms of naturally increasing the acidity. And so we have, as you can see, almost 4.96 TA to 567 in the treated, and this is mainly due to the succinic acid and some lactic acid, because I think there is a bigger preservation of the malic by the yeast, and so we have actually at the end a higher lactic. And also the Saccharomyces ovarum is known for high glycerol production, and so we have 8 versus 11 grams per liter of glycerol. I appreciate these are the two wines that you have in front of you, so the 3 and the number 4, and we are basically done. I don't know if there are any questions, any comments. Yep. Any questions? Yep. Wait just 1 second for the mic.
Hi, Clint.
Hi.
My question is, what are you doing as far as getting away from fossil fuels for your machinery?
That's a great question. For machinery, unfortunately, we haven't been successful in moving away from fossil fuels yet. But as far as our commercial buildings on the ranch, everything is on solar power now. So we're almost 100% solar with all of our buildings. And so that's our biggest move at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you for this very interesting presentation, because we can have the global point of view on the vineyard and also what happened in the winery. I don't really have a question. It's just more a comment on your first presentation and the global, the overall diagnosis you made on the global warming and the consequences on our industry. I fully agree with what you said, and for the long-term point of view, it's true that the vineyard is probably the solution. For the short-term solution, I also considered, as you said, the pH is very important, and it has a lot of consequences on the flavors. I mean, when you reveal the aromas, the flavors, because obviously, as you said, you have difficulties also to accumulate all these tannins, polyphenols, and all that stuff. And the flavors, and to play with to manage the pH, there are also, and to go also where you said the management of the carbon. It's also important to mention the fact that there are also some additive-free techniques which are available based on membranes, for example, and they have an impact, very important impact on the tartaric stabilization, for the potassium, for the calcium, and also you can manage your pH. And when you manage your pH very precisely, you can reveal the flavors, the aromas, and the complexity of your wine. And that's also some solution you can have to answer or to try to manage and to cope with this global warming without any addition of products, and you manage also the carbon, I would say, life in the wineries, in the practices, in the cellars. So that was a comment, and it's obviously the debate is open, and I'm available also to answer these questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It was a really informative presentation. I had a question specifically more for Clint. I know that in France, there's a lot of work specifically on interspecific hybrids and trying to adopt that into the wine industry. I know that there's quite a barrier with entering those hybrids into the marketplace, but it's really important that we're investigating this rootstock relationship with different clones. But I was curious if you could comment on any interspecific hybrids, or if that's something that's on the forefront in the future with dealing with climate change. But yeah.
It's a great question. At this moment, with our operation, no, we're not. But I'm sure UC Davis and other people are to a greater extent. For us, we're trying to combat it in an organic or in a traditional manner, so to say. And so that's using our tried and true rootstock combinations with those novel or heritage clones to see how we can persevere through this as it gets warmer and warmer and increased growing degree days and everything else. But I feel down the road, as we continue to go down this path, that's going to have to be an option we look at. 10, 20 years, who knows how soon.
Okay, our time is up, so thank you very much, everyone, and I hope this was informative. Thank you to our presenters. Thank you.